one of our more prominent right-wing politicians is presently over in Australia and is trying to use this as an opportunity to redeem himself. It's clearly also part of some kind of bringing him back into the public eye, because the UK will have some form of general election at some point before the end of 2024. In the UK, we have a really weird system for deciding when elections are. So rather than general elections happening in the same way that they do somewhere like America, for example, where they just happen every 4 years, in the UK what happens is a government can only have a maximum of 5 years before there has to be another election, but the Prime Minister gets to decide when the next election is. So if something really good happens and they seem to be doing really well in the polls, like 4 years in, they can go, we're going to have an election now, actually. We're going to do it now. And they can capitalize on that to stay in. If things are going badly, what they'll tend to do is they'll hold off and wait for as long as possible and sort of pray for a miracle that suddenly things get better and better and better. Calling a general election when things are going well is like peeing when you don't need to pee because the adverts are on. Perfect. Yeah, so we briefly, between about 2010 and 2019, I want to say, we briefly had a law called the Fixed Terms Parliaments Act, which was meant to make it more regular so that it would be every 5 years. So we have to have an election because the 5 years will be up by the end of 2024. However, it could happen at any point before that. Nigel Farage is not currently a sitting politician. He was a member of the European Parliament for a while. He's currently also not a member of the Conservative Party. However, he did go to their conference. The Conservative Party has moved more and more to the right and embraced, particularly under Suella Braverman and under Liz Truss, did the kind of cuts to taxes that Nigel Farage would dream of. That wing of the Conservative Party, the kind of pretty far right wing that would be likely to ally itself with Nigel Farage, still has popularity amongst members of the Conservative Party. So like everyday people who have signed up to be members of the Conservative Party, who are usually a bit older, usually wealthier. And there are also a lot of members of the members of Parliament that are quite supportive. So one theory, which I think is a pretty good one, is actually that Nigel Farage, being on I'm a Celebrity, is the beginning of a campaign for leadership of the Conservative Party. So the Conservative Party are going to lose the next election massively. We know from all the polling that they're not going to do well at all. That will likely lead to Rishi Sunak resigning, and then Suella Braverman would be quite likely to run for leader. And I would wonder whether, after all those losses in the next election, whether Nigel Farage tries to pick up a seat. If this goes well, him being in the jungle, it would make sense for him to come out of that and immediately go into an election campaign after having been on TV for, I think I'm a Celebrity is 3 weeks long. Despite the fact that not everyone watches I'm a Celebrity, it is still kind of likely to set some trends, right? People are going to be talking about this. The one argument is that, he comes out of this, he uses it much like Donald Trump used being in The Apprentice. He uses it to roll straight into a campaign to become a Conservative member of Parliament. So he joins the Conservative Party, as there's been a lot of rumours around him potentially doing. He rolls it into becoming a candidate at the next election, winning a seat, and then Rishi Sunak resigns, and then maybe prior to the election after that, Nigel Farage tries to then go for the leadership. Because I don't think he's someone who would just be a member of Parliament. I think he is someone who would want to be the leader. However, I saw a slightly different bit of analysis the other day that actually he didn't want to be a Conservative MP at all. That actually his next thing was that he was going to start a campaign to get proportional representation made a thing in the UK. Back in 2015, UKIP had got 12.6% of the vote and yet had only got one seat. And this has always been a bit of a problem for any of Nigel Farage's projects, is that he's worked outside of the system. The way in which the system has worked has meant that the number of seats, that meant that like UKIP only ever won one seat through an election. On the one hand, the idea that Nigel Farage wouldn't be that bothered about becoming a member of parliament kind of makes sense, because one of the abiding lessons from his career is that actually you can have a massive impact on the politics of the country despite not being even a member of one of the two main parties. Because this 12.6% and UKIP's success during European elections as well pushed UK politics in such a way that Nigel Farage and UKIP's politicians and UKIP's members got the results that they wanted without ever winning, with only ever winning one seat in the House of Parliament. So on the one hand, that kind of theory makes sense, that analysis makes sense, because he's always worked outside of the system. But on the other, then why would he care so much about PR? So if it does lead to Nigel Farage campaigning for proportional representation, it will be really interesting. It will be really, really interesting, because a lot of the people who support proportional representation in the UK are generally on the left, because proportional representation would likely benefit left-wing parties more than it would the Conservatives. And what's tended to happen is that the Labour Party has avoided doing it. So the Conservative Party doesn't want proportional representation because the ways in which the left-wing and liberal vote tends to be split tends to help the Conservative Party, whereas the Labour Party sort of knows that it needs to be able to pressure people to vote for it, and under proportional representation, it wouldn't be able to do that. In fact, it would be quite likely that the Labour Party would split up.